Hi. So before I just throw it out, I'm going to ask a question. Tomorrow we're going to do this event, the Pixel Pitch, where the idea is that we're showcasing these projects that we selected from around the world, and they're projects that are, the story's extending into many different mediums. They're not just feature films. We've said sort of cross-media film projects. That's what the call was. But in fact, the films extend way beyond film. They happen on mobile, they happen in real life, they happen on gaming platforms, they happen online. And what we wanted to do was bring together people from different industries who haven't necessarily worked together to see how they could get together and to help develop and finance these projects. So I wanted to ask the experience of the panel, and Ben and Peter have spoken a bit about this. What has that experience been so far about crossing, finding different industry partners to work together when you have these kind of properties that work on many different levels? Can they speak together? Does their financing work? Do their distribution windows work? How's it been so far? So I should start with Lance, actually, your project you've been developing him this year. Sure.
I think in some ways you can find strategic partnerships as was mentioned in terms of going to where audience is. If you can leverage audience in effective manners, then you have something that you can build from, which is the case. Well, actually, you've seen it quite a bit with certain types of content that's been produced or either saved by audiences and their desire to have it on air or exist, but also in the sense that at the end of the day the audience is it's just a matter of how you measure it. So I think in terms of the packaging or the bundling of those things, starting with that makes a lot of sense. Other strategic partners who have similar agendas or initiatives. I've done that in the past with various tech providers in certain ways. There's new technology that's always emerging, different ways, new HTTP, HD streaming codecs, and the way people are streaming or interactivity that they're doing as overlays. So finding strategic partners that give you some first mover advantage in the market is usually pretty good. So primarily in those two areas, and then I guess trying to bring brands back through that. Something that gives them a potential first mover advantage that might give them some press hook, and then on the other side of it, something that gives them access to audience. Those things have been effective for me in the past.
And Ted, have you, with the sort of latest films that you've been packaging and putting together, have you sort of gone to some non-traditional film financiers to sort of work on the films with you?
No, I still do it all the old way. That there's, luckily that those folks still exist. But what I do find, is precisely what Lance mentioned as the first thing. That one of the things that allowed my latest film to come together was the kind of recognition that all of the players in the field, particularly Rainn Wilson, who has like 1.5 million Twitter followers, and James Gunn, the director, who's had a webisode series, PG Porn, with 5 million hits, were recognized as people that brought their own audience to the equation. And that's the kind of thing that I hear on the studio level already starting to have an effect. And you have to think that at a certain level that there will be, particularly in the traditional indie finance world, where someone says, well, we're not greenlighting your film until you have 5,000 friends or something like that. And certainly I've had conversations with several people at like, what do you think the proper threshold for a debut filmmaker is? So as filmmakers who haven't started to aggregate their audience, now's the time.
Yeah, I heard something that it's Ashton Kutcher who's got the biggest Twitter following. I think he's got more followers than the population of Ireland, Panama, and Norway. But
he had more followers than viewers for his last TV show, which got canceled right away, and I found that kind of interesting.
Well, it's kind of interesting the engagement is on Twitter as opposed to on TV, maybe. So.
James Gunn, the director of this new movie, who's a competitive guy, said, well, he only has 60,000 Twitter followers, but the potency of his Twitter sperm is much stronger than Rain's 1.5 million, because more people will follow his actions. And, you know,
how
and
does
frankly,
he test that?
He says what he waits for Rain to say something, then he says it, and more people do it when he says it, even if he doesn't originate.
There's no biological test for that yet. Any questions so far from the audience? No questions? I can't see. Oh, over there in the middle. Thank you.
Hi, it's about nurturing talent, really. And I suppose if a kind of modern day Woody Allen came to you, had a very interesting idea as a kind of catalyst for a project, I suppose how would you handle that kind of the transparency and the kind of flexibility, but also, I suppose, creating a safe space, I suppose, for an initial artist to work, whilst kind of, I suppose, someone who wasn't fluent with Twitter or didn't want to engage.
Is that to Ted? Was that a question to
Yeah,
Ted?
yes, I just spoke.
Well, if they didn't want to engage, that's a very difficult situation to deal with. But if they were modern Woody Allen, you know, he had tons of material, you know, in terms of his stand-up and jokes and just general writing, and that there's certainly ways to feather that out into the marketplace and to have other people work to champion it. You know, I try to spend a little bit of my own time trying to find new talent that I've discovered myself, you know, through different points of reference that I can say a few kind words about and put up and out there. And I look for other people who take a curatorial role in what they present and try to do the same sort of way. And I feel that we will get to the point that there will be key folks who are out there and engaged in communication saying, this is something that you should look at, that is very much about original discovery in a non-corporate sense, a non-branded sense. It feels, you know, authentic. And hopefully, you know, when that net and web is actually knit, folks like your hypothetical Woody Allen will be able to get that kind of carriage and champion. But it requires us all to take greater responsibility in that sort of filter process.
And Karol, have you found, now you're sort of commissioning films and you're acquiring films, are the filmmakers you're choosing to work with, are they people who are sort of quite actively engaged? And you specifically now working with filmmakers you know are going to be actively engaged, I should say, with their audience. I mean, that's way more of an attraction for you?
Not everybody's you know, wholly engaged with their audience. I think that that's a little bit of a learning curve for filmmakers. And what we do, you know, actually, just let me try to answer that question a little bit differently also. We deal a lot with the digital rights merchants, whether they're the CAAs or the Cinetics or the Content Republics that represent filmmakers. And then we also deal directly with filmmakers. And on both sides of that, some folks are very engaged and have ways of reaching their audience, and then others don't. I think that when they start seeing the platforms in action, particularly the mobile and the online, it generates an excitement for them where they realize, wait a second, we can actually get our material out to folks, and if they do have their built-in audience, they will engage with them. But it's very, I mean, we have some filmmakers that we're dealing with that are extremely organized about that and have big followings, and others that don't.
And have you seen a big difference in the results of how the films have...
Well, I would say that, in terms of how the films perform?
Yeah, on your channel.
Yeah. Absolutely. Those that have that understand the various social networks that are out there, the ways to reach their core audience, you know, they'll track better in terms of the views. What I have seen is over the course of the last 12 months is a tremendous, you know, increase in an awareness and understanding of what's going on. That's really the exciting thing. I've been at Babelgum for a year, and in that year alone, things have changed dramatically. And I think that trend is going to obviously continue. And, you know, big players, small players, everybody's trying to get into it. But the filmmakers themselves are really starting to understand the space a lot better.
Any more questions? One down here in the middle.
Hi there. There was something I think was raised a little earlier by Sheila, who was talking about, was it 40% of the budget put aside for marketing? And this afternoon seems to have somehow contradicted that to some degree. I was wondering, for instance, Lance, would you say that you would spend that much of your budget on marketing? Because it seems to be that everybody here is talking about how much the filmmaker can do to market without that kind of budget in that kind of way. Isn't that what we're moving away from?
I think in terms of the, and maybe I'm a different case because of the way that I'm designing the work, but a lot of it's designed so it naturally embraces some of those, what you would hope to be the uptake. It thinks about the community, and in some ways you've seen it very effectively with like social change things in the United States, like the way Obama was elected into office in the U.S. It's kind of looking and saying, okay, well, can I deliver an experience that has the story that's going to be engaging to the audience, and then give them something that they're going to want to tell somebody else about or discover that way. And then at that point, if I can ignite it that way, then the P&A or the marketing costs become different. It's not necessarily about having to push out as much to market and promote it. But there are costs that are associated with that in terms of the community management of those things, in terms of how you deal with it. So it's almost like taking what would be earmarked for that and saying, okay, how can we apply this in a way? Because you're seeing a shift in the roles, at least in terms of how things are produced. So it makes sense to earmark something like that, whether you call it marketing or whether I would call it some degree of community management. It's just the nuance and based on the experience level that somebody has and what they choose to do with it.
But I find that in talking to territorial buyers of traditional film content, that they get very excited with the idea that I'll bring a project that has added value of this world community that is actively engaged. They still think that they'll still have to spend that money, but this is an additional thing that they'll essentially be getting for free. And when I talk to private equity investors on projects about doing something in this space, they get very excited because they see an additional asset that is being developed beyond just the film content. That there's a community that somehow they don't know, but that's something else that they get. I was very impressed this past week, in the States, Paranormal Activity. I don't know if it was referenced earlier today, but it's a $27,000 homemade, DIY movie that was bought by Paramount, purportedly to remake and then shelved, and when DreamWorks is sold off, brought out again. And they used Eventful, a tool for audiences to demand screenings. Now, Paramount still spent a lot of money on this grassroots marketing campaign, but they produced the highest per screen average on record right now for that movie. And there was a much greater feeling of ownership, I think, in the fan base, because people were saying, this is a film that won't get out and won't get seen. I just pledged to go see it, on this date, and it really, truly worked. So they still spent a lot of money, but they utilized, all the social media tools in a very effective way.
And I guess talking about the projects that Dan and Peter have been making, a lot of the visual assets and the story, is it marketing or is it part of the story anyway?
I think the wonderful thing about these kinds of entertainment experiences is that they are inherently viral if you get them right, and the community and the fan base can promote them on your behalf. And that's fantastic, and they should all be designed to sort of maximize that potential. But I think at the same time, marketing dollars are always helpful, and it's very difficult to battle if you are relying purely on self-promotion. And I think, in planning any kind of piece of entertainment, you want to have a bit of oomph behind you, and it's hard to replicate for the value that you would get with, homepage placement, let's say on MSN. It's enormous and all very helpful.
Another question. Actually, let's get one over there. So we can have one from the back.
It's a question for Peter and perhaps Ben. Peter, you said that regarding Cell, that you had returned money to the originator. curious what its gestation was, whether an originator brought it to you or whether it was commissioned, and how you see the new contractual models in relation to writers. Also, because I noticed the way you reference stars in all that you're doing, how do you see writers alongside that?
When we did Cell, we promised O2 they'd get their money back in 2 years. I think we're coming up for the 2-year anniversary next February, so it's been around for about 18 months. And I, you know, as a producer, the way to get the cost down on some of these things, if you do have the confidence that there is a long tail of revenues coming back in, is to try and keep the costs low up front, of course, through talent, writers, directors, or whoever you want to have as part of the participation at the back end. I think there is, we're working with a writer in the audience here, Rachel, who we hope to have that sort of deal with a new drama that we want to do. So it's very important to incentivise everyone along to keep the cost down in the first part and clearly benefit people along the way. The problem is you can't always guarantee that. We've achieved it with Cell. We've had many that have failed along the way as well. So we all hopefully are taking risk and reward.
Great. Another question over there.
Hiya. My question's about finance. Sorry. A lot of the projects that people have talked about today have had budgets of around £100,000 or less. And I was wondering, in terms of the future and being able to access bigger budgets, what do you see that as being, and how do you think we're going to be able to achieve that?
I can start on that. I think a point I made in my presentation was I don't think we can rely on any one business model at the moment. You've got to have a mixed economy, whether it be advertising dollars, consumer payments, distribution revenues off the back end of it. I think the market is just too small at the moment to rely on any one. You can get lucky, of course, get a big brand, a big studio to fully finance your show, but you know, working with Ben and some other producers we've worked with, you do definitely need to be very open-minded. We've produced shows from £100,000 to over £1 million in the digital space. The £1 million show had 14 sponsors in it. You've got to really work hard to get it. And the life cycle to get this money together is definitely 6 months plus at the moment, I would say.
For me, the logic is the same sort of thing that has existed in independent film finance for a while, hopefully avoiding the disaster that we eventually reached. That I've always subscribed to the notions that I tend to make difficult movies, difficult subject matter, that I have to price my films at where I know the market is and then basically cut it down by like another 20% to mitigate what people see as the risk factor. And as a result, my films have consistently delivered a positive return, and I've got to consistently keep making movies as the budget's kind of inched up, along the way. But meanwhile, the business overall disregarded that, and you watch the independent sector start to make a whole lot of very overpriced art films that kind of wiped out, financing in indie film for probably 2 or 3 years in some ways, in sort of large-scale basis. When I look at cross-platform content and trying to figure it out, the imperative of making sure that you deliver a return so that you can grow that model is all of our responsibility. Too often the questions always come up: how can I get more money? How can I get more money? Let's screw over the brand or screw over the financier and just make this wonderful art trophy and be able to say that, we burned Rome down. So the question on all that is just really the same sort of thing as, I think, instead of asking how high we can get, how can we just make sure we're delivering a strong return right now?
And I think it's kind of interesting looking at some of the experiences that on the panel that Christy was moderating. They were much higher budgets as well than the films we're talking about. And I think the level of sort of interaction is so invaluable. And a lot of the filmmakers who started off with budgets, maybe the independent filmmakers started with film projects. They were stories that were one format. They started discovering that they could extend them much further. And maybe if they sort of built them into their business plans at the beginning, they, you know, it might have been easier to raise finance from other places. And that's kind of what we're trying to sort of look at, that it's not creatively things are changing with audiences, interacting with stories in different ways, but also the idea of value and building value in by extending story is so immense and very exciting. Another question over here.
Do any of you guys worry about Facebook fatigue?
What?
Facebook fatigue. You know, there's been a lot talked about how some people are not using Facebook as much anymore, or some people are just not signing up to Facebook because they don't like the idea of them, what they put on Facebook, not being able to retrieve it very easily, or it being perhaps used.
But
yeah, you know, that whole thing that people are talking about Facebook. I mean, what's the model coming up to replace that if that fatigue really becomes critical?
Well, I think, you know, fundamentally, there's a couple things with Facebook's offering that are difficult. You know, they own the information. You don't necessarily own the information. You build the audience there. They own it there. They keep it. So there's certain things that are happening with data portability, which are exciting. But I think in some ways, some of the next generation of social networking, and I kind of lightly touched on this, is going to really be driven by media, which is very exciting. And I think you're going to start to see it open up more. And I know that projects through Movable Type and WordPress, WordPress being an open source project, has a thing called BuddyPress, which is a series of plugins which will effectively turn any blog into a social networking type of outlet for whoever wants it. I think you'll start to see more niche-oriented social networks, which already exist anyway. In terms of the market share that somebody like Facebook has, that stuff ebbs and flows. You know, Facebook is in a position where as long as they have the equity, you know, as long as they have the burn rate that they do, and they have that audience and they can make it work, then they probably will continue to be dominant. They've done very well in terms of the core functionality that they have and the value proposition that they have to an audience who maybe is looking for a way to communicate with other people. In terms of the longevity of that, it's hard to say. I think you start to see, yes, there's definitely burnout with it. There's definitely people who come in and go out of it. I mean, you see the same thing with something like Twitter and the builds that they have. But as long as people push money into those models, they'll stay as long as they have that money. I think their big thing is figuring out how do they create revenue, because a lot of those are Web 2.0 models where it's about build the audience, build as much audience as we possibly have, and then we'll figure out the way that we can leverage that and the way that we can actually sell against it. And Facebook has struggled with those things, you know, with the launch of Beacon and the way that they want to try to use personal data that you have and how they leverage that. So I think it's those things come and go. I mean, I think Facebook is around for, you know, to stay for a period of time. It'll be interesting to see how they leverage that network and how they really deal with certain aspects of some open solutions that are going to come in and challenge some of that.
Okay, there's someone who's got a question right at the back.
I guess this is a response also to what Lance was just saying, and perhaps also the original question asker, and I was just curious how you guys might react to this. It's a bit of a nerdy observation, but there is like an hour-and-a-half long video right now on the internet about Google Wave, which is set to be a federated platform for multimedia communication, and it's going to be pretty upsetting in terms of a lot of the prototypes we've been looking at today on screen in terms of generating real-time collaborative interaction across many different media simultaneously. So I was just curious if anybody in the panel had anything to say to that.
Yeah, can I take that?
Does anybody else have anything to say?
Yeah, I'll take that. I think Google Wave, in a lot of ways, is very exciting. I think it really starts to tap some of the idea of the real-time web and the interaction, and some of the stuff that I was hinting at with the story gateway concept is that's a data stream, you know, and once you start to have that, you can start to use that as a next generation of the way that you tell stories, and you can immediately start to see the reactions of what somebody thinks and be able to move and maneuver in that environment. So I'm very excited about Google Wave. I've played with Google Wave. I think it's really interesting. I think it's a step in the right direction towards an integration of that product set. You know, I think in some ways Google is looking for ways to kind of reduce the amount of the amount of stuff that's sitting on their servers in terms of how people use their mail clients. So I think it's, they're merging it over and trying to purge in some particular way. But I think it's interesting in terms of that real time. I mean, you see it with something as simple as Twitter and the way that works. But the idea of Google Wave, I think, is exciting, and I think you'll see more and more popping up that takes. That's the importance of the data. That's the importance of being able to harness it in an effective manner. So.
There's one question.
This is for Peter and Ben. Where do you see online video being in 5 years?
So where do you see online video being in 5 years?
Yeah.
Well, I would say where it's trending now, certainly more popular, but I think that bandwidth is likely to increase, and so it wouldn't surprise me if the length of videos that were being watched tended to go up. Obviously, we've been in a world where I think the average length is still around 3 minutes. Services like the iPlayer are working very, very well. It's delivered over IP. It's sort of an online video experience. So I think people watch longer videos and probably on a variety of different platforms much more seamlessly than they can now. I think we'll be in pretty much a converged environment then, where the TV has a lot of the functionality you associate with the PC now.
My sort of take on that is that 5 years is clearly a long time, but we could be in a position where there's more on-demand viewing of television content, whether it be online or via IPTV type platforms, than we get television viewing. There are some statistics and trends that show that, and I think Hulu and iPlayer have definitely shown that long-form content can be used online with the bandwidth that goes with it. I think the exciting thing is, though, and I suspect there will be far less of it than the long-form passive viewing, is to use the interactivity and the storytelling and the social networking linked together like most people have been talking today. I think that will still be a minority in 5 years' time, because people do take, audience behaviour does take a while and lags technology significantly. So people will be watching their EastEnders and other type shows online maybe in 50% of the time. But unfortunately, the stuff we're talking about today will still be in a minority. It may take up to 10 years, 15 years, whatever it is.
There's somebody right at the back who really wants to ask a question.
Hello, this is a question for Karol. I've actually just found out today that Cinetic Media are taking our film on for digital rights management and television in the US. So
Good luck.
Thank you very much. I'd be very interested to know. I think that says it all, really. I'd be very interested to know what Babelgum paid for End of the Line and Rage for digital rights.
End of the Line actually had nothing to do with Cinetic whatsoever. That was something that went directly to the filmmakers. I went directly to the filmmakers on that through a tip from who was it? Jess Search. To look at it, and because we have a very focused interest in sustainable films and also an underwater focus, that was a perfect fit for us. It had nothing to do with Cinetic. In terms of Rage, I can tell you that it was, in my opinion, it was a healthy sum that we paid for the very, very slim sort of rights that we acquired, which are those iPod rights, the internet free on demand. It was 5 figures. It was more than 60 and less than 90. $1,000.
You might as well say it.
That's dollars. One important thing, though, is that's a minimum guarantee that we paid. We also invested money on the digital marketing side, so there was a digital P&A commitment that we made. What the back end is for the filmmakers, that's something else, because that was a deal that did go through Cinetic. As I said before when I spoke, I mean, that's an amount of money for the rights that we acquired that far exceeds the amount of money that I was paying for 15 years in all media for films when I was running a film division, a regular distributor. So it's actually a healthy amount of money. But it's have to be very careful with looking at that because we're in an experimental mode right now. So there were other reasons why we paid that amount of money for that particular film in this particular time frame. It was something very specific that I knew that would work on mobile and online, and because of the film itself, it was a perfectly lined up film for the time. I can tell you.
Thoughts on Cinetic?
Do I have any thoughts on Cinetic?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, they're very nice people. No, they're one of the digital rights merchants out there. They have you need, as a filmmaker, you need to be pretty savvy about your rights in general, and also to understand that your digital rights are extremely carve-upable. You can carve them up. Now, when you're dealing with someone like Cinetic or anybody else, usually they're getting the suite of digital rights, and you may, at the end of the day, not see as much money as if you're dealing with someone like myself or somebody else directly. So you just have to be mindful about it. What's good about Cinetic is that they're really pushing. They're talking to all the players, not only myself. They're talking to everybody, and they're trying to make it work for filmmakers that are maybe not that savvy about every aspect of the business. So my advice is, it's good to work with them. Pay close attention, and think about your next project, how you might be able to work with them and everyone else.
Thank you, Carol. I'm sorry, I just realised the time, and we're going to have to wrap up because we've got to be out of here sort of very, very soon because there's a screening going on. Before we do, I want to say a massive thanks to all the speakers today. Their presentations have been totally inspirational. And then I wanted to also just say a few things. The videos for the conference are all going to be up on our site next week and also on our Babelgum channel, so probably from Monday or Tuesday. Also, the conversation doesn't end here. Most of our speakers have blogs that they talk about these kind of things regularly and converse and tweet. Power to the Pixel also tweets and has its own website where we're going to actually ramp it up over the next months. We're launching something called the Pixel Report that Michael Gubbins is going to be editing, where it's going to be full of contributions and advice and analysis that we're going to sort of continue over the next 6 months, and then we're going to do a kind of summary, a report that we're going to give out. It's all for free. Then a quick mention about our next event. We are working in partnership, we're very excited to be working in partnership with Arte Cinema in France, and we're doing an event with them on the 3rd of December in Paris. And I should just say, very importantly, I keep on being reminded and I forget, please fill in your monitoring forms. They're really important for us. First, to give us some feedback on what we do next and how we get better. And then we also really need them for our funders. And it's really important for our continued funding. Then a bit about the party. Tonight we've got the launch of Breathe, which I mentioned was a project that we launched last year at the Forum. The first screening starting at 6:15. And then there's a screening every hour. So the party is at the museum, and that's go out of the front door by the river and turn left until you get to the London Eye and go up some steps by Ozo Restaurant. So hope to see you all there. Thank you very much for listening, and have a good evening.